When Emperor Tiberius in 16 AD cancelled all offensive plans in Germania, the borders of the Roman Empire settled more or less on the Rhine-Danube frontier. While these borders would ebb and flow in relation to successful and unsuccessful military campaigns, diplomacy, and internal conflicts, the frontier would remain as the default border all the way until the fall of the Western Roman Empire. But while there are strategic benefits to having a major river as a defensive line, this border was far from an impregnable wall. In many aspects, it was merely a line on a map separating the lands of Romans and the lands of so-called barbarians. The Roman frontier was always under threat by some of these barbaric peoples. This threat would culminate in the Marcomannic Wars, surpassing any conflict Rome had faced until that point. Two major sources that describe this conflict are the Roman History by Cassius Dio, as well as Historia Augusta, or the History of the Emperors. One of the best depictions of the war is the 30-meter tall column of Marcus Aurelius, which contains 116 relief depictions of the war. Despite all this, it is worth noting that, just like many other ancient wars and events, the chronology of Marcomannic Wars remains unclear due to the mixed and contradicting reports by ancient authors. In many cases, the sequence of events also remains obscured and unreliable even by several years. This is what we have. It is the year 166 AD, and the Roman Empire is thriving in its golden age under the rule of Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus. The so-called Golden Age was a period under 5 consecutive emperors, starting with Nerva in 96 AD. But after 70 years of relative stability and prosperity, Rome would face a great threat from without. At that point, many communities outside of the Roman borders would be affected by large-scale migrations, which would in turn cause other communities to also migrate. Such was the case of the Gothic ancestors Gutones, from the Baltic Sea towards the Black Sea. Many barbaric communities started to press towards those already settled at the Roman frontier. These were in many cases already vassals of Rome or had at least some kind of treaty or an understanding with them. This allowed additional protection of Roman border, which was very attractive to peoples outside of it for its land and goods that were often traded with them. The stability of Rome and its prosperity spread across the border and allowed the barbaric societies to also achieve economic and demographic growth. These Roman neighbors of Germanic and Sarmatian origins, like Marcomanni, Quadi, Iazyges, Naristi, and Cotini, that were now threatened by the outside tribes, sent embassies to Emperor Antonius Pius, the predecessor of Marcus Aurelius, asking him to let them become a part of the Roman Empire. But the emperor declined, for he judged that the new territory wouldn't bring any value to the Roman state. It is also worth to note that Antonius Pius and Marcus Aurelius didn't need nor necessarily want to conquer new territory, even when they came on the silver platter. But the war was becoming inevitable, despite the diplomatic attempts to postpone it as much as possible. Marcus Aurelius put in the effort to recruit new legions or transfer existing ones, particularly those that were at the time posted at the battlefield against the Parthian Empire. Another circumstance has to be mentioned here, one which would affect the coming conflict on a large scale: the Antonine Plague. This would be the first large-scale pandemic spreading across the Roman Empire, at least that we know of. And despite being called plague, it is believed today the spreading disease was actually smallpox or measles. Supposedly, the Roman armies got infected in the eastern frontier with Parthia and then spread it as they were transferred into Europe. This had a great effect on the Roman army and the general population. The total number of dead remains to be debated to this day, but it decimated the Roman army to the point that Marcus Aurelius was forced to create new legions from gladiators, slaves, and bandits. Besides the lack of soldiers due to the pandemic, lack of money also contributed to the crisis and inefficient Roman response. To regain needed financial resources, the emperor even prepared a 2-month-long auction of royal inventory, including artistic products, pots, pottery, and attires. Whatever the case, the war itself began in 166 by 6,000 Langobardic and Obi warriors crossing the Danube and facing the Roman army, which was able to repulse the invaders. The success was short-lived though, as people across the entire length of the Danube soon started pouring into the empire, searching for a place to settle. On the way, they ransacked Roman towns and countryside in the border provinces. The most impacted region was that of Pannonia, through which Marcomanni and Quadi marched into Italy. They passed through Petovia, Celeia, and Alpine passes. Once reaching the lowlands of northern Italy, they destroyed the city of Itergium and besieged Aquileia and pushed all the way to Verona. Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus managed to push them back, discovering bodies of armed and armored women among the corpses. Most of the remaining barbarian kings and their people began to retreat. The two emperors pushed back towards the Danube, making sure to put measures in place to ensure the defense of Italy and former Illyricum. As a result of this, a defended military zone was created in the region centered on the passes between the Alps and the Adriatic Sea. This zone, held by the Second Legion, was meant to prevent new incursions into the Roman heartland. From Carnuntum at the Danube frontier, the two emperors started to return to Rome, but in the early 169 AD, Lucius Verus succumbed to an illness, perhaps food poisoning or more probably due to the rampaging Antonine Plague. Marcus Aurelius returned to Rome alone, where he buried Lucius Verus with all honors. It is also in this year when 11 Germanic kings of separate peoples, including the Marcomannic king Balomarius, sought peace with the Pannonian governor. Cassius Dio actually puts this event immediately after the initial attack. This makes little sense, and it is more probable that this event falls in some time after the death of Lucius Verus. The truce was signed and the oaths exchanged, but the peace wouldn't last long. Marcus Aurelius returned to the front, accompanied by his wife and dignitaries. He would lead the overall military operations, first from Carnuntum and then from Sirmium, while his military commanders would lead on the battlefields. First he focused on Marcomanni and Quadi. If the previous first phase of the war between 166 and 169 AD was marked by Roman defeats until their final push to the Danube, this second phase puts the Roman armies on the offensive. But it did not begin well. In 170, amidst heavy battles, the emperor asked the greatest mystic and oracle alive how the Roman army could prevail. The oracle told him to throw 2 lions along with other gifts into the Danube river. The lions managed to swim to the other side, where the barbarians slew them. After that, the Roman army suffered one of its worst defeats, with 20,000 soldiers dying. At the same time, other parts of the frontier have also been crossed. This prophet, Alexander, was then already considered by some as the biggest fraud of his time, and how much this report of this event is true should be considered with a grain of salt. The command over the Roman armies was then taken over by Pompeianus, the emperor's son-in-law, and the future emperor Pertinax, who pushed away the barbarians once more. Pompeianus has introduced improved strategy and brought reinforcements from distant legions. This enabled the Roman side to achieve victory in most battles. The war continued. In 171, the Romans managed to intercept a horde of invaders that raided the provinces, as they were trying to return across the Danube. Many, including Quadi, then sent embassies to Marcus Aurelius to sue for peace. As the ancient historian Cassius Dio writes, Marcus remained in Pannonia in order to give audience to the embassies of barbarians. For many came to him at this time also. Some of them, under the leadership of Batarius, a boy 12 years old, promised an alliance. This received a gift of money and succeeded in restraining Tarbus, a neighboring chieftain who had come into Dacia and was demanding money and threatening to make war if he should fail to get it. Others, like the Quadi, asked for peace, which was granted to them, both in the hope that they might be detached from the Marcomanni, and also because they gave him many horses and cattle and promised to surrender all the deserters and the captives, 13,000 at first and later all the others as well. The right to attend the markets, however, was not granted to them, for fear that the Yaziks and the Marcomanni, whom they had sworn to not receive nor allow to pass through their country, should mingle with them and passing themselves off for Quadi, should reconnoiter the Roman positions and purchase provisions. Besides these that came to Marcus, many others sent envoys, some by tribes and some by nations, and offered to surrender. Some of them were sent on campaigns elsewhere, as were also the captives and deserters who were fit for service. Others received land in Dacia, Pannonia, Moesia, the province of Germany, and in Italy itself. Some of them, now who settled at Ravenna, made an uprising and even went so far as to seize possession of the city. And for this reason, Marcus did not again bring any of the barbarians into Italy, but even banished those who had previously come there. In 172, the long-postponed invasion by the Roman army could now finally take place. They marched outside the empire's borders and invaded the land of Marcomanni and their allies. The war was tough and cruel and included events like burning of villages and executing prisoners. It is not known exactly when the victory over Marcomanni was achieved, perhaps already in 172 or 73. The Romans then turned against the Quadi, who broke the peace by sheltering the escaping Marcomanni. At that point, the barbarians surrounded the Roman army, who was dying of thirst, wounds and fatigue, but was saved at the last moment by a surprise storm. Cassius Dio tells us, "When the rain poured down, at first all turned their faces upwards and received the water in their mouths. Then some held out their shields and some their helmets to catch it. And they not only took deep draughts themselves, but also gave their horses to drink. And when the barbarians now charged upon them, they drank and fought at the same time. And some, becoming wounded, actually gulped down the blood that flowed into their helmets along with the water. So intent, indeed, were most of them on drinking that they would have suffered severely from the enemy's onset, had not a violent hailstorm and numerous thunderbolts fallen upon the ranks of the foe. Thus, in one and the same place, one might have beheld water and fire descending from the sky simultaneously, so that while those on the one side were being consumed by fire and dying, and while the fire on the other hand did not touch the Romans, but if it fell anywhere among them, was immediately extinguished. The shower, on the other hand, did the barbarians no good, but, like so much oil, actually fed the flames that were consuming them, and they had to search for water even while being drenched in rain. Some wounded themselves in order to quench the fire with their blood, and others rushed over to the side of the Romans, convinced that they alone had the saving water. In any case, Marcus took pity on them. He was now saluted Imperator by the soldiers for the 7th time, and although he was not wont to accept any such honor before the Senate voted it, nevertheless this time he took it as a gift from heaven and he sent a dispatch to the Senate. Dio also adds that the storm was supposedly conjured by an Egyptian wizard who summoned god Hermes, while the later Christian authors credit the miracle to the praying Christian legionaries. The Romans finally managed to subjugate the Quadi by 174 AD. The war continued, with the Romans quickly turning towards another enemy, the Yaziks. In the winter between 174 and 75, the two met on the frozen river Danube, fighting in conditions unfamiliar to both of them. The Roman discipline and drilling paid off though, and in the aftermath of 175, they both signed a peace treaty, like with the Marcomannian Quadi before. The Yaziks were to return 100,000 prisoners of war, and as vassals of Rome, send them 8,000 cavalry. Some sources argue that Marcus Aurelius was forced into this treaty earlier than he wanted, originally planning to create 2 new provinces across the Danube, but he was prevented by a revolt in Syria. While traveling east to resolve this crisis, the Danube frontier exploded again. The battles of 177 were fought in the emperor's absence, while the stationed legions had to be regularly supplied, as shown on the column. Displeased by the earlier treaties, both Quadi and Marcomanni rebelled again, forcing Marcus to once more return to the frontier. This marks the beginning of the Second Marcomannic War, starting in 178. The Roman army immediately found success, pushing far into the lands of the Quadi, about 100 kilometers beyond Rome's borders. Never before or after had the Roman army invaded and fortified so far beyond the empire into the temperate Europe. Once more, different tribes sent embassies to the emperor, who discussed different treaties with each of them. For example, he agreed to more lax conditions with the Yaziks, while he was much more harsh with Quadi and Marcomanni. In each land of the latter two, Rome stationed 20,000 soldiers and built sufficient fortification that included baths and other amenities. Alongside, the subjugated tribes agreed to send warriors to serve with the Roman army. While there were still plans to create two new provinces, Marcomannia and Sarmatia, the plans were abandoned as it would prove too big a cost for the empire. The war still continued in 180 when Marcus Aurelius died. The place of his death was either near Vindobona or near Sirmium. Commodus, son of Marcus Aurelius, became the new emperor, ending the tradition of adoptive emperors and also ending the so-called Golden Age of the Roman Empire. Commodus continued the war, the so-called Third Marcomannic War, of which not much is known. Rome again faced Marcomanni, Quadi and Buri, followed by another peace, in which Commodus largely followed the examples set by his father. The biggest difference was that Commodus agreed to abandon the border's expansion and returned with his force to the old Roman border. It would be more accurate to call this war Germanic-Sarmatian War due to the wide variety and numbers of peoples it involved, especially the dangerous Quadi and Yaziks. This war presented a massive challenge to the Roman Empire that suffered and continues to suffer with Antonine Plague even after the wars. The protective frontier along the Danube that was being built and expanded for more than half a century proved inadequate. Along this, the superiority of the Roman army over the barbaric hordes became questionable. The war, the pandemic, and the death of the last of the 5 good emperors put the empire on the back foot. The quality of life from the declining number of Roman inhabitants worsened, and during this time, new settlers from Greece changed the ethnic structure of the provinces like Pannonia. It is also during this period that the Germanic peoples were allowed for the first time to settle within the Roman Empire by the emperor's decree, especially in those provinces that were most affected by the pandemic. The war didn't provide a satisfactory conclusion to the problems that would culminate in the following years and ultimately lead into the decline of the Roman Empire. The Germanic and Sarmatian peoples were still under pressure from the tribes outside and would continue to rise in rebellion again and again, and the Roman frontier was far from impregnable. However, it was also thanks to Marcus Aurelius, who successfully protected Rome's borders, that the empire's independent development continued for another century. Emperor Tiberius, whom we mentioned at the beginning, set the default Roman border to the Rhine-Danube frontier. If you would like to learn about his ascension to the throne and the consequent uprisings of Roman legions, click here to watch the next video or link in the description. Be sure to like, subscribe, you know how YouTube works, and I will bring you more history soon.